Chapter 311. Experienced workers are better. 3. I headed towards the magic department's arena after seeing that there were no major issues at the swordsmanship's arena grounds, but the scene I saw there was sheer madness. Louise. The future tower master is turning the match around. Louise, show us that magic you used last year. Mages and students were waving their wands in the air and shouting loudly. The energy felt like a military pep rally gone completely off the rails. The madness left both the principal and me speechless. To be honest, I had somewhat prepared myself after sensing the growing excitement as we approached the magic arena, but I had only imagined a crowd gathering for Louise's duel, not this idle concert-like atmosphere. Snapping back to my senses, I glanced around. Even the students from other arenas had abandoned their matches to join the cheering crowd. What the hell is wrong with all of you? Even the teachers who should have been restraining the students were joining in. Even if we excuse the students, shouldn't the teachers show some restraint? It seemed they'd chosen to be mages before being teachers. I guess we didn't really need to come and cheer her on too, right? Rudy's finally broke the silence. The scene unfolding before us was so overwhelming that even Rudis's usually talkative mouth was momentarily shut. In this situation, we should come and cheer her on even more. Imagine how Lady Louise would feel without her club members here to support her. Ader, who had joined us on the way, replied to Rudis's words. I agreed. Louise wasn't particularly attention-hungry, and with all these mages going wild, she'd likely be shrinking into herself. In such a situation, she might panic if she couldn't even see her familiar club members. Looking toward the arena, I saw Louise trembling slightly as she gripped her staff with both hands. It wasn't noticeable unless you really focused, or even if you did, it was easy to miss, but she was definitely shaking. Our capybara seemed to be the type to get scared when given too much attention. What would have happened if we hadn't come? As Ader said, Louise would have been fighting a lonely battle if the club members hadn't been here. Not against malice, but against a sea of rabid fans. Looking now, Louise's opponent was the same guy who was thoroughly beaten by the Mage Duchess's unique magic last year. He genuinely looked happy to be facing Louise again. If someone walked in without context, they'd probably think he was the one winning. Ah, Lather's there too. Looks like he finished early. I instinctively almost turned to look at Eric's words, but I managed to resist. He was a mage too, so he might have contributed to this madness. He wouldn't be much help for Louise's mental state. Whoa, the triple burst, and not long after, the crowd erupted in another thunderous cheer. Louise cast the Mage Duchess's unique magic again, her opponent grinning as he eagerly received its full brunt like he was embracing a gift. As expected, all mages were crazy. The sane ones were a tiny minority. These guys have nothing but magic in their heads. No matter how you looked at it, the idea of mages being symbols of reason was clearly an elaborate PR stunt. To begin with, a truly rational person wouldn't dedicate their entire life to a single field of study. I had just shattered one more stereotype about mages. Louise finished her duel victoriously and came down from the arena to a standing ovation from all the mages. Everyone could see that Louise's face had turned bright red, but the crazed mages didn't seem to care, their cheers reaching a fever pitch. If I, her future husband, hadn't been watching, they might have even tried to carry her on their shoulders. Oh Opa, you did well. Louise, who came to us almost running, looked up at me with moist eyes. I could read the extreme mental distress in those eyes. But to be honest, I might have reacted the same way. That was amazing, Louise. Your moves were even sharper than last year. Meanwhile, Lather, who had been buried in the crowd, quietly approached and offered words of praise. It seemed that he realized how ugly his behavior had been as the heat in his head cooled down. As a club member, not only did he fail to comfort Louise, but he had joined the Legion of Madness. Unfortunately, his realization came too late. Louise just stared silently at Lather while being nestled in my arms. For someone as kind-hearted as Louise, this wordless gaze was probably the closest she could come to expressing resentment. Lather seemed to understand this and quietly closed his mouth with an awkward expression. Make sure to always reflect on today's events, blue hair. Louise, I don't know much about magic, but even to me, you were really cool. Thank you. Fortunately, Louise's battered mental state was restored by Sarah's praise. The betrayal she felt from one club member was soothed by the support of another. If anything, that was the silver lining in all this. We arrived at the club room for the after party after the practical exam. I put a macaron that Louise had made earlier into my mouth, but I couldn't properly taste it. I felt conflicted. After watching Louise's duel, anxiety rose from deep within my chest. Everyone has improved. At first, Louise was shrinking under the weight of the frenzied cheers. But once she started wielding her staff, she stood firm and confident, a strong and capable mage. The fervor might have gotten to her a little, but it didn't change the fact that she shone. A friend's progress was something to be happy about. Even more so when that friend would become family in a few years. Yes, it was definitely something to be happy about, but am I the only one falling behind? I couldn't help but have negative thoughts. It wasn't just Louise who had advanced far. I didn't see Rudy's and Lather's matches directly, but from what I heard from them, it seemed that they ended with better results than last year. Louise, who found a teacher in the Mage Duchess, and Rudy's and Lather, who received excellent education as royalty, were all advancing further than me. Of course, I was improving too. I neglected my training during the first semester when I was following Louise around, but I have given it my all since then. Even during the winter vacation, I focused solely on training except for the time I spent with Sarah. I saw results proportional to my efforts, and I gained confidence that I could beat anyone except Rudy's. In other words, I still didn't have the confidence to surpass Rudy's. A teacher really is important, huh? There was a limit to advancing alone. But the family knights said they had nothing left to teach me, and it was difficult to ask the patriarch, who spent more time in the council. Without a guiding hand, I couldn't be sure if I was even heading in the right direction or moving at the right pace. Sure, the academy offered lessons, but those were generalized teachings for the masses, not tailored to the unique needs of the Crossius family's style. Rich. Maybe I needed to find a private tutor. Someone who couldn't teach the Crossius's way, but at least provide one-on-one instruction tailored to me. Eric. Huh. A light tap on my shoulder woke me up from my thoughts. Why are you sitting there alone? Is something wrong? Looking up towards the voice, I saw Hung holding a cookie. This was embarrassing. My expression must have been pretty bad if Hung felt the need to speak up. No, it's nothing. I'm just thinking about something. I trailed off as a realization hit me. Come to think of it, I didn't need to look far for a teacher, did I? Someone who could provide me with instruction befitting the Crossius family and who could give me one-on-one lessons, someone who was skilled and could show me the way forward. Isn't that Hung? That was exactly Hung. He walked the same path as me and had reached heights I couldn't yet imagine. He was the ideal person who had arrived at the place I was ultimately aiming for. I'd forgotten such a simple answer. Honestly, I'd forgotten because I had never even seen Hung carrying a blade, let alone a sword. Hung, what? His response was a bit curt, but that was just how he usually spoke. If anything, he was more polite with strangers or people he needed to keep at a distance. I learned that during our year together at the academy. So, I gathered my courage and continued. If it worked out, great. If not, I'd survive. It wasn't like Hung would lash out and call me arrogant for making the request. Could you maybe teach me? And even if he did hit me, that would be fine too. I'd be learning firsthand what kind of techniques he had. I frowned at Eric's sudden words. Teach him, me, with what qualifications? Oh, advisor, are you taking on disciples now? Unfortunately, Eric's voice wasn't particularly quiet, so it drew the attention of other club members, especially a certain redhead who was obsessed with swords and was the loudest. Rudis's voice instinctively brought back memories from last year. Last year during the inter-class competition, Rudy's coughed up blood because I failed to control my strength. When I visited him to apologize, this lunatic had the audacity to request further instruction. A maniac like that was bound to react to any mention of teaching. I've never taught anyone. Anyway, I answered firmly, loud enough for both Eric and Rudy's to hear. It was true that I was stronger than Eric, but being strong didn't automatically make someone a good teacher. If that were true, then why would we need education specialists? They'd just have strong people teach and be done with it. And if I interfere, I might trip you up when you're already doing just fine on your own. I meant it. Regardless of whether I had a talent for teaching or not, Eric was objectively growing well. Being at the top of his class in an academy full of nobles meant that his future as a big shot was guaranteed. It was hard to compare anyone to Rudy's, who had the resources of a prince from a nation of knights. However, the fact that Eric could even stand in the same ring as Rudy's spoke volumes about his exceptional talent. I might have been lucky so far, but there's no guarantee it'll continue to go well. But seeing Eric speak so dejectedly, I understood him a bit. A spear? You're a swordsman, so why would you even think about switching to a spear? If you keep switching your main weapon, you'll end up neither here nor there. I had felt the same way before. When I was sent to the north with just a sword, rolling around in actual combat, I became anxious about whether I was doing things right and tried to learn all sorts of techniques. Looking back now, as Gerard said, I was on the verge of becoming a jack of all trades and a master of none. All the alcohol I get from now on is yours. The spear suits you better than the sword. I guarantee it. And then, he immediately taught me. What a crazy bastard. Still, I can't. Someone who can't teach properly will only mess things up. Although, my heart wavered for a moment, I shook my head again. I understand, but I can't help. I wasn't about to let Eric stumble down the same chaotic path I had with Gerard. If the older brother walked a path of fire, then the younger brother should walk a path of flowers. Then, advisor, how about having a duel with Eric? A duel? While Eric couldn't speak after my firm refusal, Rudy's attempted to assassinate him. Was he crazy? This was coming from the guy who'd ended up coughing up blood the last time he sparred with me. And now he wanted to shove someone else into the line of fire. Originally, warriors gain enlightenment just by observing a master's sword technique. If direct teaching is difficult, then letting him figure things out on his own might be the next best thing. But surprisingly, Rudis's words made sense. Besides, you and Eric are brothers. If Eric progresses on the right path, he'll become like the advisor. If he knows what the end point looks like, he'll know how to chart his own path. The following words were also very reasonable. As I turned my gaze from Rudy's back to Eric, I saw Eric looking at Rudy's with sparkling eyes. He seemed touched by this unexpected support. So I just need to show you? I casually asked Eric. Why yes. Come on, then. I jerked my chin at Eric, who was nodding hurriedly. This felt like I was a delinquent who was inviting someone to the rooftop, but these kinds of things were better handled on the spot. That said, a duel was out of the question. I wouldn't be able to face Mother if I failed to control my strength with Eric as I did with Rudy's. A family where the older brother beat up his younger brother to the point of bleeding was a disgrace. A decent idea came to mind. Chapter 312. Experienced workers are better. 4. Following Hung's instructions, we moved to the open space behind the building. Usually, it was a familiar area where we played foot volleyball, but standing here for a lesson filled me with tension. I didn't mean for everyone to come. Hung stood in the middle of the lot, speaking with a slightly awkward expression. We weren't the only ones there. Not only Louise, Sarah, Ainter, Rudy's, and Lather from the club room were there, but also Tanyan, who had returned after watching the practical exam until the end out of concern for potential injuries, and the Mage Duchess, who had just finished grading the magic department students. It was an astounding gathering of all club members. It was such a coincidence that it felt like they might have been watching from the hallway and joined in. Haha, when else would we get to see the advisor's skills? What's so entertaining about that? Hung responded indifferently to Rudis's words, but for once, I agreed with Rudy's. I know Hung was strong. He had fought in the war a few years ago, and just last year he showed an overwhelming difference against Rudy's, someone I wouldn't dare claim to beat, without breaking a sweat. Slamming an opponent to the ground barehanded was impossible without a significant skill gap. However, I had never seen Hung use a sword. I knew he was skilled, but I couldn't gauge exactly how strong. Rudy's, the victim, was probably even more curious about this than I was. Isn't it better to have many witnesses in case something happens? Everyone will understand if it's an injury from a fair duel. Tanyan's smiling words sent a chill down my spine. If I ended up coughing blood or breaking limbs while dueling Hung, would they all testify it was just a sparring incident? Of course, I wouldn't complain if I got injured during a duel, but it was unsettling that they were already considering it a foregone conclusion. With the future saint watching, I couldn't help but worry Hung might actually bend my spine in half. It's not a duel. I wouldn't knock my little brother down. That sent an even bigger chill down my spine. Did that mean he would have if I weren't his brother? No wonder he knocked Rudy's out without hesitation back then. Oh, then will you duel with me? I'm up for it. I said it's not a duel. At Hung's firm words, both relief and disappointment settled among the club members. Relief from those worried about Hung assaulting royalty again, and disappointment from the red-headed prince alone. Experience isn't just about physical clashes. Observing with your eyes is also experience, isn't it? That's right. Sometimes, observing a master from a third-person perspective lays the foundation for growth. The Mage Duchess nodded at Hung's words while placing her hand on Louise's shoulder. With the Mage Duchess's support, the persuasiveness increased rapidly. How could one not believe when the pinnacle of magic, someone who was already raising a disciple, said so? That's right. No matter how I thought about it, the Mage Duchess was correct. Learning through physical experience was only possible when the skill gap was moderate. If it was too overwhelming, I'd probably collapse without even realizing what hit me. Just observing the sword technique with my eyes would be more beneficial. Let me borrow your sword for a moment. Ah, here. I hurriedly offered the sword at my waist to Hung. It was just a mass-produced sword prepared for duels, and I was planning to just clean the blade and stash it away after today. From the sword's perspective, it would probably be happier in Hung's hands. Not bad. It's quite sturdy. After tapping the blade, Hung nodded and gripped the hilt with his right hand. Honestly, our gap isn't small, but if you keep working hard, you'll reach my level. If I could do it, you can too. Then he stepped forward with his left foot and extended his right hand, which was holding the sword. It was like a knight showing respect to an opponent before a duel. So for now, aim for where I am. If you look too far ahead, you'll get lost. My level should be a reasonable target for now. As he spoke, he slowly lowered the extended hand to his right side. His arm extended diagonally from his body, the blade pointing towards the ground. It was an upward slash stance. Indeed, the basis of Crossius's swordsmanship, no, all swordsmanship, was downward and upward slashes. Was he going to show us the most basic of basics? Rather than disappointment, I felt more excitement. Hung was a swordsman who had advanced far beyond comparison with me, and this was an opportunity to see how the basics of such a swordsman were built. We're on the same page. Rudies, who had been a few steps behind, had somehow moved next to me as if to get a closer look at Hung's sword technique. Glancing at his face, I saw it filled with rare seriousness instead of his usual smile. As expected, he did have a strong warrior spirit despite his frequent eccentricities. I also watched and learned from this technique. It gave me hope that with effort, I could someday reach that level. His words froze me. What was this? That wasn't something you'd say about a simple demonstration of basic movements. It sounded more like he was about to unleash a once-in-a-lifetime strike. At the same time, I felt an unusual energy emanating from Hung's body. Even though swordsmen were less sensitive to mana than mages, we were still mana users. If someone was manipulating mana with such intensity right in front of you, it was impossible not to notice. And right now, that was happening with Hung. This is crazy. I could feel it. The mana surged explosively from his heart, moving toward his right chest before igniting in a secondary burst. Refined twice over, the mana consumed his right arm and sword, radiating a malevolent, almost tangible energy. Wait, hold on. Why was his mana visible to the naked eye? It was shocking. I wanted to check the reactions of others, especially the Mage Duchess, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. It felt like I'd regret it for the rest of my life if I missed even a moment of what was happening before my eyes. In silence, Hung manipulated his mana and slowly raised his sword. Each subtle movement was accompanied by a tearing sound, the ground splitting open beneath his feet. It felt like watching a fierce beast, its weapon lazily trailing after it. Yet, with each step, the world seemed to scream in agony and vanish into nothingness. Then, at the moment when Hung, who had been calmly raising his blade, suddenly sliced through the air. I lost everything. My eyes were open, but only a pure white space spread out before me. My ears were open, but I couldn't hear even the sound of the wind. My skin couldn't feel any sensation, as if my body wasn't mine, and even my nose couldn't detect the simplest scent of grass. It was as though the world before me had stopped existing, or I had been exiled from reality itself. But this strangeness was just for a moment. A deafening sound like the world forcibly yanking me back into existence restored my senses. How was it? Hung asked with a slight smile, pointing at the sky as he coughed up a handful of blood. Following his gesture, I cautiously raised my head only to let out a dry laugh the moment I saw it. This is the technique Heaven's Defier showed during the Great War in the North. Ignoring my reaction, Hung continued explaining. He wasn't called Heaven's Defier simply for challenging the mandate of heaven. If he had been just a challenger to the mandate, he'd have been a mere lunatic. If all he did was unite the nomadic tribes, they might have called him a strategist or a leader at best. There was a sound of metal hitting the ground, as if he had thrown away the sword he was holding. But I just stared blankly at the sky. He was called Heaven's Defier because he insulted the heavens, overturned the natural order, and dared to meddle with the divine law as a mere human. At those words, the existence of Heaven's Defier, which I had only read about in textbooks, felt both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The battle that earned him the name Defier, the calamity he unleashed upon the Imperial Army in that fight. Soon, that awe extended to Hung. The Imperial Army called that calamity, world destruction. What kind of person was Hung to be able to replicate such a calamity? Of course, the name felt a bit ominous, so most people just called it Sky Cleaver. Another dry laugh escaped me. Sky Cleaver was a name so straightforward and fitting that it couldn't be more perfect. The sky I couldn't tear my eyes away from had a hideous black gash several meters long. Quote. It's been sliced open. That's why it's called Sky Cleaver. The sky had been torn apart. What the hell? This actually worked. I surprised myself. I hadn't done this since the war, and I didn't expect it to succeed so smoothly. I was prepared to play it off as, the Heaven Defier did impressive upward slashes too, if it failed. Honestly, I hadn't dared to attempt it since getting stabbed by Kagan. Every time I so much as thought about it, my body screamed in protest. The mana amplification process alone would have ripped me apart from the inside. But drinking the Mage Duchess's potion rapidly restored my health, and now I'd regained my health to the point where I could attempt this feat again, a stunt that should only exist in theory. The Mage Duchess was truly amazing. What a monster. I spat out another mouthful of blood, wiping my lips. My insides must be wrecked because blood kept coming up, and the sword I borrowed from Eric had shattered into pieces, emitting a brilliant light. Damn, I just noticed my right arm had gone completely numb. Did I cut a nerve? Still, reproducing this made me realize again just how monstrous Kagan was. This was a watered-down imitation, and even that left my body in shambles. Yet Kagan used the fully upgraded version without breaking a sweat. Of course, he might have been bluffing, but unlike me who was visibly bleeding profusely, that bastard appeared unscathed. At least on the outside. Impressive, isn't it? I spoke to Eric, who was still staring at the sky. Slowly, he lowered his head, his face a turbulent mix of emotions. I felt the same way when I first saw it. I thought, what kind of lunatic could do something like that? It's not something a human being should be capable of. For a while, I wondered if an evil god had descended. I wasn't exaggerating. The Dawn Sect's scriptures mentioned that Enon sealed evil gods in the northern part of the continent, and the nomads happened to live in the northern part, too. For a moment, I thought they might have unearthed one of those sealed gods and made it their leader. But in the end, Kagan was still human. And if a human could do it, then so could I, or so I convinced myself with twisted determination. Well, he wasn't just a human but an apostle of a god, but still, he fell under the human category. The emotion you're feeling now, turn it into competitive spirit. Then, you can become like me. Probably. Oh Appa. As light returned to Eric's dazed eyes, Louise, who had been silent, rushed over in a panic. To be honest, having Louise and the Mage Duchess here made me push myself harder. It was only natural for the head of a family to want to look cool in front of his loved ones. Why your arm? Huh. At Louise's tearful words, I glanced down at my arm. The right one, which had gone numb, was now lying on the ground. Ah, so the nerves weren't just severed, the whole arm was. Oh, baby, are you okay? The Mage Duchess, who had rushed over with Louise, caressed my cheek with trembling hands. Of course I was fine. Losing a limb was almost an everyday thing in the north. With this continent's magic and divine power, reattaching limbs was a quick job. Besides, it wasn't such a sad thing if I thought of it as leaving something behind for the new generation. If Eric was motivated by today's events, then an arm was a small price to pay. I might have overdone it. In hindsight, it would have been better to spar with Eric and let him cough up a little blood instead of pulling off this stunt. Louise and the Mage Duchess, shocked first by the torn sky and then by my torn arm, seemed to have no intention of hiding my eccentricity and shared it with Margetta and Irina too. Thanks to that, I spent the whole day comforting all four of them. Tanian quickly healed the injury itself, but sadly, there was no cure for their shocked hearts. Of course, that much was fine. Even I would have been shocked if my lover's limb had exploded right in front of me, even if I knew it could be healed. This was my own fault for being so thoughtless, it was something I needed to reflect on. Damn it, the real problem came after. The academy was thrown into chaos due to the otherworldly noise and the scar left in the sky. And in incidents with many witnesses, someone had to take responsibility. Regarding the disturbance at the Academy, we wish to hear a detailed explanation from the executive manager currently stationed there as an inspector. Return to the capital promptly. The Crown Prince's summons came within a day. Did the phrase, "hear a detailed explanation," mean, "come and justify your stupidity"? Or was I just imagining that tone? Well, it was fine even if it wasn't my imagination. My disciplinary record had been reset after my last imprisonment, anyway. One more disciplinary action is no big deal. People with nothing left to lose were always bold. Chapter 313, You Don't Have This in Your Country 1. A grand performance that tore the sky. The one silver lining was that we could quickly erase the scar left in the sky. Even the scars left by Kagan faded with time, so it was no surprise that my sloppy imitation vanished even faster. If those marks were permanent, the skies of the north would already look like some cursed demon realm. Nature, no matter how much humans affected it, had a way of healing itself. Plus, the Mage Duchess was among the spectators watching Sky Cleaver. While the move may sound grand, it was ultimately a technique utilizing mana. And when mana was involved, it was under the Mage Duchess's control. Thanks to her, the scar that would have disappeared on its own was sealed even faster. I felt really grateful the Mage Duchess was at the Academy. The trace itself disappeared within 5 minutes. Not many people got to see. Enough. I shut my mouth at the Crown Prince's firm words. As usual, the teleportation mage sent to retrieve me had been excessively polite, and the guard knight opened the office door the moment I arrived. The Crown Prince, whom I faced after this streamlined process, was pinching the bridge of his nose and glaring daggers at me with his eyes. So, I immediately bowed my head and started explaining. Even though I had nothing to fear with my disciplinary stack reset, I could end up under house arrest for insubordination in one go if I acted too cocky. I needed to avoid that. Executive manager, you know that time isn't the issue here. At his words implying he wouldn't accept excuses, I involuntarily lowered my gaze. I couldn't argue with that. He had a point. The sky was already torn, so what difference did 5 seconds or 5 minutes make? Whether a blade was stuck in your heart for 5 seconds or 5 minutes, the outcome was the same. Seeing that I'd fallen silent, the Crown Prince paused momentarily before continuing with a sigh. Fortunately, the Academy is far from any major cities, so the disruption was minimal. Even in the areas where the marks were visible, people only reported seeing something black in the sky. Most didn't leap to the conclusion that the sky itself had split. Once again, the Crown Prince wasn't wrong. It wasn't like anyone would see something unusual in the sky and immediately think, "Ah, the heavens have been cleaved in two." Most people would just assume it was some strange phenomenon. Unless they directly saw the sword being swung, it was hard to imagine the sky being torn. Moreover, it would be an ill omen if the sky over the capital turned black. But since it happened at the Academy, it's easier to dismiss it as the result of a magical experiment, especially since the Mage Duchess was there. The Academy was where the incident happened, where the pinnacle of magic, the Mage Duchess, was. As the Crown Prince said, there was a possibility people would just assume the mages did something weird again. This might not be so bad. As I listened to the Crown Prince, hope began to rise. Maybe this would be settled with just a moderate penalty. While it was true that I tore the sky, others didn't seem to think so. To them, it was just another routine magical mishap. Of course, a black scar in the sky wasn't something that happened by simple mistake, but it was more natural to think it was the aftermath of magic rather than concluding it was slashed by a sword. In short, there had been a crime, but there were no victims, and practically no witnesses. I'm saved. If there's no victim, it'll be just a reprimand, at most a written apology. However, not everyone thinks that way. With this sudden drift, my hope rapidly bowed its head. Reports have been pouring in non-stop since yesterday. The remnants of Heaven's Defier have appeared, the ghost of Gar has returned, and all sorts of ominous rumors are circulating. Saying this, the Crown Prince handed me a stack of documents with another sigh. Judging by how tightly he was gripping them, it seemed he was desperately holding back from throwing them at me. I took the stack and checked it before he could actually throw them. The urgency and panic in the reports were evident in every line. Traces of world destruction observed in the sky above the Academy. Only a handful of individuals in both the Imperial Army and Nomad forces could imitate world destruction. Of those, only the executive manager and Udasar Dorgan are still alive. Possibility exists that the fugitive Udasur Dorgan taught world destruction to his subordinate nomads and infiltrated the empire. The reports were riddled with speculation and unfounded theories, almost like pressing a self-destruct button for paranoia. It was less a set of reports and more a collection of baseless conjectures. Can this even be called a report? Anyway, I instinctively closed my eyes at the contents, which were no different from the Book of Revelation. Come to think of it, there were many commanders and soldiers who participated in the Great War of the North. If even one of them was near the academy or in a nearby territory for any reason, promotion, unit transfer, retirement, they would have noticed immediately. No one who had seen world destruction would ever forget it. But wait, something felt off. The reports mentioned that I, the executive manager, could imitate world destruction, so why weren't they thinking I did it? Wasn't the probability of me doing it higher than Dorgan infiltrating agents into the empire? Causing a show of force at the Imperial Academy, the Empire's top educational institution where noble children gather, is clearly a challenge to the mandate of heaven. Given that key foreign figures are also enrolled, the probability of the executive manager causing unrest at the academy is low, so Udasur Dorgan's. I reread the section and once again closed my eyes, letting out a silent groan. It made sense, I couldn't argue against it. Logically, who would imagine that the very person tasked with protecting the academy would unleash a technique used by Kagan right in its heart? What do you think? The Crown Prince's calm words sounded like, "I'm going to kill you." Damn it, even I had to admit it was insane, so I couldn't even ask for leniency. Indeed, the executive manager was a loyal subject. Perhaps he was worried that I might be worn out from work or feeling bored with the repetitive routine. How else could I explain him causing such a colossal incident? Every time I received one of his surprises, the fatigue was washed away in an instant. Truly, there was no one more loyal, or rather, no one else like him. The world didn't need two of him. Having just one was already more than enough. Will he change as he gets older? Reports came flooding in from the Southern Empire like screams. The executive manager, having read their grim contents firsthand, bowed his head deeply like a criminal. No, he was a criminal. Anyway, he took on the posture of a guilty man. It was an unsightly sight. The executive manager was an indispensable subject, so I had to keep him close whether he gave me surprise gifts or terrible ones. But I really hope he'd restrain himself by his 40s or 50s. If he causes such incidents even then, I don't think he'll be able to endure it. I don't want to be an emperor who collapses from high blood pressure. What do you think? How could I have anything to say when my recklessness has caused your highness such great concern? This irritated me even more. I could at least punish him for insubordination if he were brazenly defiant, but it was hard to get angrier when he immediately bowed his head knowing he had caused me trouble. He had certainly mastered strange survival skills. Still, with the executive manager thoroughly humbled, I can proceed with my plan without a hitch. According to the report from the commander of the southern forces, the mages were all shocked. Being mages, they seemed to have immediately realized it wasn't the result of magic. At these words, the executive manager's head bowed even lower. Then the mages at the academy must have known as well. If they tell their families or countries about yesterday's events, it will spread across the continent quickly. It was my carelessness. Trying to cover up actions with words is cowardly, don't you think? Yes, Your Highness, your words are wise. After hesitating for a moment, the executive manager spat out the words as if coughing up blood. Good, now the executive manager would have to accept whatever outcome, no matter what. The imperial family will make an official announcement about this incident. It will say that the sky was split by the executive manager's sword technique and that the Mage Duchess can verify this. The imperial family had chosen to spread the news rather than contain it. If it was something that couldn't be hidden anyway and was something that didn't need to be hidden in the first place, it would be advantageous to announce it in the name of the imperial family. This way, the incident would become something done with the imperial family's instruction and involvement instead of the executive manager's impulsive action. The executive manager seemed to have reached the same conclusion, as his gloomy expression began to brighten. Wasn't it the executive manager personally showing the pinnacle of swordsmanship for the sake of the diligent academy students? While it might seem a bit excessive, it shows how much the executive manager cares about the empire's future, which is commendable. You flatter me, Your Highness. I just nodded at the executive manager's quick response. There was nothing more to say. I was too mentally tired for a lengthy discussion, and the executive manager was perceptive enough to understand with just this much. Now, it's the knight's turn. When the Mage Duchess became a visiting instructor at the academy, the Empire gained both tangible and intangible benefits. Mages flocked to see and hear even a single lesson from the mage who had reached the pinnacle of magic, and with them came requests and appropriate compensation for smooth entry, activities, and enrollment. I could only laugh hollowly when the Mage Duchess first decided to go to the academy, but only positive things happened once she actually started being there. Having tasted this sweetness, it was only natural to look for other ways to utilize it. In the midst of this, the executive manager, who was stationed at the academy, showed off an impressive display with his sword. Although it was just an imitation of Heaven Defier's technique and his son could use it, others didn't know that. First magic, now swordsmanship. A warrior, capable of splitting the sky with their blade. Once this rumor spreads, it would cause as much commotion as the Mage Duchess did. This will be interesting. When it was the Mage Duchess's turn, the Ernesto Academy of the United Kingdom of Yuban bowed its head. Those who prided themselves on being a magic powerhouse submitted to the Empire. Then, wasn't it now the turn of Armine, the Kingdom of Knights, to submit? Armine needed to be brought to its knees at every opportunity as a country bordering the Empire and the next strongest after it. Moreover, their arrogance as a Kingdom of Knights had always been insufferable. But now, Armane's pride was at its end. A Kingdom of Knights. Did they have a warrior who could cut the sky? While the ranking among warriors was complex compared to the magic world with its overwhelming number 1, that was no longer the case. At least on the surface, the executive manager was now its undisputed champion. I survived. I was prepared for house arrest at minimum or worse when the Crown Prince pulled out the reports, but it fortunately ended without any penalty. Wasn't it the executive manager personally showing the pinnacle of swordsmanship for the sake of the diligent academy students? Sure, that statement was clearly a setup for additional responsibilities, but I could live with that. A bit of extra work was far better than being confined or detained. Besides, I wouldn't need to go overboard and act like an overly enthusiastic teacher. Just as the Mage Duchess taught as she pleased, I can take a similarly laid-back approach. Unlike the Mage Duchess's situation, which coincided with the start of the school year and attracted a crowd, mine was in the middle of a semester, so outsiders wouldn't suddenly flock from across the continent to ask for teachings. Good thing I slashed the sky. If I had aimed poorly and cut the academy instead of the sky, it would have ended with a sure penalty. Indeed, if you're going to do something crazy, it's better to go all out. Not that I plan on doing this a second time. Chapter 314. You don't have this in your country too. I am a sinner, a wretched man who had brought disgrace upon his family. Though I did learn some swordsmanship as a member of the Valenti family, I never trained as intensively or professionally as Carl. So, there may be aspects of a warrior's nature that I don't fully understand. Margetta said softly while sitting in a chair. Despite her gentle words, my head bowed lower and lower. Just because she was speaking gently now didn't mean that Margetta's anger had subsided. While I had managed to calm my panicked lovers before being summoned by the Crown Prince, all I'd done was bring them out of their initial state of shock. Emotions like anger typically came after the initial confusion, didn't they? So if I were to say something like, "Thank you for understanding," at this moment, I might end up receiving a slap across the face. It probably wouldn't hurt physically, but I'd die mentally. But Carl, Margetta gently got down from her chair and knelt before me, carefully taking my hands. You're not alone anymore, are you? After holding my hands in silence for a moment, Margetta finally spoke in a voice that sounded like she was about to cry. The guilt that surged within me at her words was overwhelming. I'll graduate from the academy next year. And then we'll get married, and we'll have children. A sniffle came from the side. I couldn't see who it was since my head was still bowed, but judging by the direction, it was probably Louise. So, is it selfish of me to want Carl to take better care of himself? No, not at all. I hurriedly raised my head to see Margetta smiling. Sadly, this was driving me crazy. I had thought everything was resolved after returning safely from the Crown Prince, but now I wished I'd just been punished instead. This wasn't anger, it was tender-hearted pleading, and anyone with a conscience would crumble under it. I suppose I should say something too. The second wife-to-be spoke up after the first wife-to-be. Even the Mage Duchess, who usually embraced everything I did with a motherly heart, was looking at me with an unusually cold gaze. Baby, what were you planning to do if there hadn't been a priest available? I bowed my head again at her words that cut straight to the core. Raise your head, we're not scolding you, we're asking because we're worried. So, I lifted it again. Besides, not just any priest could have healed a severed arm on the spot. If the future saint hadn't been there, you'd have had to live as a one-armed man for days. I'm sorry, I could only apologize as every word was correct. Honestly, I attempted Sky Cleaver because Tanian was there, but I couldn't say I had it all planned out while being scolded. They'd probably scold me even more for doing it while knowing I could get hurt. After all, a mistake and intentional action were fundamentally different issues. As I suffered through Margetta's emotional appeal and the Mage Duchess's factual assault, I discreetly looked to the side. Damn those guys. I saw Eric and Rudy's sitting silently in a corner as if this had nothing to do with them. However, those two weren't entirely innocent in this mess. Eric asked me to teach him, and Rudy's requested to at least see my sword techniques if a sparring match wasn't possible. In other words, they were the catalysts for this incident. But considering the club members' defense that no one could have imagined I'd cut the sky when asked to show a sword technique and the fact that everyone wanted to see me swing a sword and not only didn't try to stop me but watched as a group, those two weren't held responsible. Their instincts are good, at least. That said, while no official blame was assigned, that didn't mean my personal feelings were unaffected. After all, human logic and emotions rarely aligned perfectly. Had either Eric or Rudy said the wrong thing in this tense situation, they'd likely have become targets for everyone's frustration. But those two clearly understood that silence was their best strategy and wisely kept their mouths shut. It seemed their instincts had told them this was a time to stay quiet. If only that bastard Rudy's was always this quiet. Oppa, huh, I hurriedly turned at Irina's sudden voice. The Imperial family didn't reprimand you or anything, right? Irina, who had been patting the sniffling Louise, asked with anxious eyes. It was a valid question. Cutting the sky in the middle of the academy wasn't an ordinary occurrence, and Irina had already witnessed me being put under detention and imprisonment. It was only natural for her to worry if I might be punished this time too. It's fine. They actually said I'd brought honor to the Empire and asked me to continue guiding future generations. The Crown Prince didn't say it exactly like that, but it was roughly the same meaning. I proved that the Empire had a warrior who could cut the sky, and all sorts of swordsmen would flock here as they did with the Mage Duchess if that warrior was at the academy. Pretending to teach them would bring substantial benefits to the Empire. Does that mean you'll tear the sky open again? However, Irina was worried about my well-being, not the Empire's gain. I won't need to teach everything, so it probably won't happen unless absolutely necessary. That means you might do it. Again, I tried to reassure her, but my choice of words unfortunately backfired. Damn, should I have said, never, instead of, probably. Then again, realistically, I might end up doing it a few more times. I didn't want to make a promise I couldn't keep. I'll try my best not to use it. Oppa, I deliberately ignored Irina's shriek. A civil servant didn't make promises they couldn't keep. There was someone who always seemed to take joy in my messes as if they were his own victories. Hey, I heard you split the sky. After escaping from my worried lovers, who were on the verge of stripping me to check for additional injuries beyond my arm, I finally made it back to my lodgings. As soon as I entered, I received a call from the minister. You've already heard, of course. Since yesterday, I've been bombarded with calls from retired folks. I instinctively lowered my gaze at those words. It seemed like there were more retired officials living near the academy than I thought. What's gotten into you? You barely used it even during the war. That's precisely why I couldn't use it during the war. Who would wait around while I prepared a technique that could kill me if I got hit? That's true. I sighed at the minister's chuckling. A few people besides me and Dorgan could use the downgraded version of world destruction. But even then, it was more of an intimidation tactic used to crush the enemy's morale before a fight began, not an actual attack. In fact, it was safe to say it was almost never used offensively. Why? Because if people were in a situation dire enough to use world destruction, then it meant they were facing an absurdly strong opponent in a battle of life and death. And how were they supposed to charge their energy in front of such a foe? The idea of enemies politely waiting for people to finish powering up only existed in magical girl cartoons. Carl Crossius, you and I are evenly matched. How about we each unleash our strongest blow and end this? You crazy bastard. Of course, the world was full of people who seemed to live in their own bizarre reality. Take Tala, for example. When our fight dragged on with no end in sight, he actually suggested we both unleash world destruction and call it a draw. It was an incredibly stupid idea. So, I did it immediately. Anyway, what really happened? Did you have a lover's quarrel with Her Grace the Mage Duchess? Well, admitting that I did it to show off for my younger brother required more courage than I thought. I lay on the bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. My head hadn't been working properly since yesterday. To be precise, my thoughts were consumed by Hung's insane display, leaving no room for anything else. If Sarah hadn't spoken to me from beside me, I might have become one with the floor, stuck there like dust. I had asked Hung for guidance because I wanted to learn from an excellent teacher and to confirm if I was on the right path, and also to see the destination I would eventually reach. If you keep working hard, you'll reach my level. If I could do it, you can too. Ha! A hollow laugh escaped me as I recalled Hung's words. I could do what he could do if I kept working hard. Nonsense. Progress through effort was a given, but effort didn't solve everything. People were also bound by the limits of their innate talents. World destruction. I couldn't stop laughing hollowly. Hung called it Sky Cleaver, but it was also known as world destruction, the technique that defined the Defier's legend. World destruction was truly an intuitive name. Not simply because it cuts the sky, it felt like there was more to it than that. How many people's worlds must have crumbled? In a war, countless. Swordsmen would have gathered, soldiers who trained in swordsmanship, commanders who practiced as a hobby, and knights who devoted their lives to the blade. So many would have seen it. At that moment, how many swordsmen must have despaired and lost hope? How many broke under the realization that, no matter their skill or effort, they would never reach that realm without being reborn? Their worlds must have shattered after seeing a gap so vast it felt shameful to call themselves human in comparison. That was why the name World Destruction was chillingly appropriate. What do you mean I can do it, too? The same went for me. Unless I was reborn or something, I wouldn't reach Hung's level either. How could someone who couldn't guarantee a clear victory against his own peers ever hope to cut the sky? It's impossible. Setting goals was important, but setting unrealistic, out-of-reach goals would only lead to losing your way. So, I gave up. I accepted that I couldn't become like Hung. Instead, I needed to set a goal that made sense. Hung and I were siblings with the same parents and learned the same swordsmanship. If Hung cut the sky with his incomparable talent, since I shared the same blood, maybe I could cut a mountain. I might not be able to destroy the world, but perhaps a city was possible. Oddly enough, seeing Hung's overwhelming pinnacle of achievement had brought me some peace. I knew there were differences in talent among humans, but now I knew there were no limits. If someone could cut the sky, what was a mountain in comparison? Let's do our best. I tried to steel my resolve. Instead of despairing at Hung's feet, I would create my own achievement. But honestly, I still felt envious. I want to split the sky, too. A swordsman cleaving the heavens with a single blade. Wasn't that every man's dream at least once? Slicing the sky really was a man's ultimate fantasy. Should we ask the advisor to show us one more time? Seeing Rudy's speak with a serious face confirmed my suspicions. He had been captivated by Sky Cleaver, too. Go ahead and try if you think you can convince Her Grace the Mage Duchess to let it happen. But he gave up with a bitter expression when I mentioned the realistic barrier. Unfortunately, cutting the sky was no longer something Hung could do on his own will. He'd have to persuade his would-be wives, all 4 of them. And if he tried to pull it off without getting their approval first, he'd likely be kidnapped by an enraged quartet before the sword even left its sheath. I guess we'll never see it again. And while I could imagine convincing the others, I couldn't picture persuading the Mage Duchess at all. Why doesn't Armine have someone like this? I almost shook my head at Rutus's regretful mutter. If people like that existed in every country, then wouldn't that be a sign of the apocalypse? Chapter 315. You don't have this in your country 3. I never particularly wanted to know about the celebrity life the Mage Duchess must have lived for decades, but I had been feeling it all too intensely these days. Excessive attention was poison for a humble civil servant. I always thought you were too busy, executive manager, so I never took the time to connect with you properly. It's embarrassing to think that we've been working at the same academy and still remain so distant. Even the attitude of the swordsmanship department's head instructor was clearly different from before. Of course, he was always polite, but I originally avoided meeting academy staff except for the principal, vice principal, and at most, Gerhardt. Aside from the rare occasions when I had to initiate contact for unavoidable reasons, the head instructor was right, we'd had no real interaction. Well, from the staff's perspective, it must be scary to meet someone with inspection authority, and I also needed to avoid appearing to pressure the staff. But since Sky Cleaver and the Imperial family's official announcement, the swordsmanship department staff had been dropping by the clubroom constantly. It was almost as if they were determined to be here whenever they weren't teaching. You're too kind. It's common knowledge that the head instructor's duties are far more demanding than mine. If we'd been seen meeting too often, people would have found it strange. Haha, thank you for saying so. I subtly implied, is it really okay for you to be visiting this often? But the head instructor either missed the hint or pretended not to notice, simply smiling as he responded. Given that he had devoted his life to the sword, I couldn't rule out the former. Still, someone who was nothing but a sword-obsessed fool wouldn't have made it to the position of head instructor at the academy. Swordsmen and mages, they're all the same. I used to think that mages were the only ones who were crazy, but I realized that was a mistake. It wasn't just mages, it was everyone. No, in a way, swordsmen might be worse. At least mages didn't blindly approach the Mage Duchess. They tried to make connections in a more meticulous and annoying way. Is it because they're people who act before they think? That was a pretty plausible hypothesis. Compared to mages who used their heads to some extent, swordsmen were relatively more action-oriented. Even my acquaintances have been bombarding me with messages lately. Some of them didn't even react when I became the head instructor, but now they're losing their minds. Oh, is that so? Yes. Thanks to that, my communication crystal keeps ringing, and I can't even sleep properly. As the head instructor continued the conversation with a joke, his face showed more joy than frustration. Being the academy's head instructor was considered an honor among industry figures. If people who had been indifferent to his appointment were now reaching out, they were likely rivals or members of opposing factions. For them to bow their heads and initiate contact would be a deeply gratifying experience for him. Luckily, as someone who witnessed the executive manager's achievements firsthand, I've had plenty to share with these old acquaintances. I couldn't help but chuckle. That was essentially him rubbing the salt in their wounds while saying, "You didn't see it, did you? I'm truly grateful to you, executive manager." The head instructor bowed his head, still with a smile on his face. That gratitude likely encompassed two things: the opportunity to gain an edge over his rivals, and the chance to witness the pinnacle of swordsmanship. Who wouldn't be delighted to achieve both without lifting a finger? And the fact that he came personally to express this gratitude showed that the head instructor was a person with an above-average character. That was why I wasn't outright refusing his frequent visits even if they were a bit annoying. It feels odd to be thanked for something as trivial as swinging a sword. Is that so? Then would it be alright to ask you for another small favor? Oh, that would be a bit difficult. I shook my head with a smile in response to the head instructor's joke. I didn't mind other things, but an encore performance was out of the question. If I did that, the person who asked for it would face the Mage Duchess's wrath head-on. I should have realized it when the head instructor said he received surrender calls from rival factions. It was obvious which group he was talking about, it could only be one. Armine. Yes, that's right. I felt an overwhelming urge to sigh after seeing VR nod his head embarrassedly. They'll probably push for a visit to the Imperial Academy. Of course, the cooperation of the Imperial Academy and your consent as the person involved come first, but… VR trailed off, seemingly embarrassed to bring up the subject. Of course, I understood. VR was just a messenger conveying his country's intentions. He wasn't at fault, it was the people behind him that were the problem. They're fast. Still, it wasn't shocking, I had already expected this. The Mage Duchess's residency at the academy had drawn mages from all over the continent. I'd seen it firsthand during the club fair, when students from Ernesto Academy swarmed the Imperial Academy en masse. If I hadn't foreseen a similar response from Armine, I'd have to question my own intelligence. It was only a matter of time before they made a move. The problem was just that it was much faster than expected. As expected of Rudis's homeland, their ability to act was no joke. Robin's Academy, following Ernesto Academy, the next to request a visit to the Imperial Academy was Robin's Academy, founded under the name of Armine's royal family. Its symbolic importance in Armine was unmatched. And the big shot from the rival faction who declared surrender to the head instructor was the current vice principal of Robin's Academy. No wonder they seemed to be bowing their heads too quickly, it was to lay the groundwork for coming to the Imperial Academy. No one has the right to block the pursuit of knowledge. And if the request is fair, there's no reason to refuse. In any case, Robin's Academy humbling itself to come to the Imperial Academy was a positive signal. An academy bearing the name of the Armine royal family acknowledging its shortcomings and coming to the Imperial Academy. It was a clear declaration of the Empire's superiority. For the Empire that seized every chance to make Armine kneel, this was the perfect opportunity. For Armine to willingly send Robin's academy to the Empire meant that Skycleaver left quite the impression. I'll inform the principal. Armine will get the outcome they're hoping for. Thank you, Executive Manager. At my quick response, VR bowed his head with a much more relaxed expression. If anything, I should be the one thanking him. As much as this added to my workload, the Empire stood to gain a lot from this. If there was just one problem, seeing the pinnacle of swordsmanship will inspire the next generation of Armane's leaders to strive even harder. Haha, looks like I'll have to put in some effort. When a country like Armine shows such sincerity, the Empire must reciprocate with a proper display of hospitality. In simpler terms, I would have to tear the sky open again. What should I do about this? Not doing it wasn't even an option. Armane's submission hinged on witnessing a demonstration of world destruction. If their students came all this way and saw nothing, they'd likely suspect the Empire of spreading baseless rumors. Honestly, I'd be suspicious too. Wouldn't you flaunt it if your nation had a swordsman capable of cleaving the sky? Keeping it under wraps would seem odd to anyone. So, I needed to unleash world destruction again once Robin's Academy's students came. That was the ideal situation that the Crown Prince, the Imperial Academy, Armine, and everyone wanted. How do I convince them? The only issue was that the mountain I'd have to climb to make this happen felt impossibly high. I cautiously broached the subject as the Mage Duchess returned after finishing her class. After all, it was easier to win over one person first than trying to persuade all four at once. Plus, if the Mage Duchess switches from opposition to support, convincing the other three becomes easier. Absolutely not. Of course, her answer was firm. Baby, have you forgotten what Margetta said? Your body isn't just yours anymore. A firm declaration, followed by a heartfelt plea. The perfect balance of strength and tenderness left me feeling like a guilty criminal for even bringing it up. No, I was a criminal. Sure, healing is possible, but just because a wound disappears doesn't mean the pain never happened. How do you think it feels for us to watch you get hurt? The Mage Duchess, who had somehow taken my hands in hers, continued with trembling eyes. Or are you saying you don't care if we get hurt as long as it can be healed? Of course not. It was such a horrifying question that I immediately shook my head. As the Mage Duchess said, healing a wound didn't erase the pain itself. There was a reason why the concept of shock existed, after all. That was why it was even more problematic. Her logic was flawless, leaving me with no grounds for rebuttal. Whether I appealed to reason or emotions, there was no way to win against the Mage Duchess. But still, they're coming all the way from Armine to the Empire. Shouldn't we show some consideration for their effort? Did you invite them? Well, no, but what kind of fool would invite foreigners into their home territory? I already had enough people in the Empire that I didn't want to deal with. It seems you've taken on a heavy burden. After pondering for a moment, the Mage Duchess muttered in an ominous voice. I got goosebumps as soon as I heard those words. Someone as experienced as the Mage Duchess must know what the Imperial family expected of me. Talking about heavy burdens in this situation suggested she was ready to storm the Imperial Palace and turn it upside down. To be honest, I'd like to see it. It would be quite a spectacle to see the Crown Prince grabbed by the collar and shaken like harvest grain by the Mage Duchess. However, if it was a matter important enough for Armine to bow its head, then it must have reached the Emperor's ears. By then, it was no longer a problem that could be solved by just manhandling the Crown Prince. Wouldn't it become a dark chapter in the Empire's history if the Emperor and Mage Duchess clashed over such an issue? More importantly, I was already paid in advance. I avoided a penalty in exchange for my cooperation. If I were to suddenly back out now within, I don't think I can do it, I'd undoubtedly face new charges, including insubordination. A pretty good idea came to mind while I desperately racked my brains. It's fine as long as I don't get hurt, right? The Mage Duchess, who had been looking at me like she was about to fly to the capital with one more word, tilted her head at the sudden question. There are holy spells for physical enhancement, aren't there? If we ask Tanion, I'm sure he can help. Holy spells specialized in survival techniques like recovery and enhancement. In practice, priests routinely enhanced soldiers before battle and focused on healing afterward. With enhancement from Tanion, the future saint, even a starving beggar could gain the physique of a champion wrestler. As long as your body stays unharmed. The Mage Duchess's voice softened as she seemed to consider this. Right, there was no reason to stop a future husband from showing off his power as long as it didn't hurt him. It was something to be proud of, even. Enhancement. Of course, it's possible. And during club time, I finally obtained Tanian's confirmation. Enhancement spells are the foundation of divinity and are learned before healing. I'm more confident in enhancement. Actually, that's great. From today on, I should officially invest in Tanian stock. Chapter 316. You don't have this in your country for. It was an ordinary day. As usual, I monitored His Highness Rudis's schedule, checked our country's forces, and had regular conversations with Yuban and the Holy Kingdom. This had been my daily routine since His Highness entered the academy, so it was nothing special. The only difference was that I was on edge about the practical exam questions. Even that wasn't too stressful, given last year's experience. Also, His Highness Rudis smiled with satisfaction after an excellent duel with a student named Charles Ulreed. Flawless protection and His Highness's satisfaction. It was the kind of day I wished every day could be like. Quote. It certainly was, until the sky split. Until the blue sky tore apart with an unsettling amplification of mana and a sound like space itself was ripping. What on earth? I was dumbfounded. I'm not sure if dumbfounded was the right word to describe that emotion, but I couldn't think of a more accurate expression. If anything, a more elaborate description might dilute its impact. The grotesque scar in the sky felt almost like an insult to the heavens. It was not beautiful by any means, yet I couldn't tear my gaze away. No, for a swordsman, that scar was more like divine guidance than a mere idol. There was no guarantee it was made by a sword. If I were to explain it to someone, they'd click their tongue and call it nonsense. However, I could feel it instinctively. This was an achievement made by a sword. I just stared blankly, for several minutes until the sky healed itself. Neither I nor the other knights nearby could speak. Sir VR. Yes. A knight spoke, his voice trembling from the lingering shock. Before he could even finish his thought, I nodded. Report this to the homeland. This was not something we could handle alone. Even if we were scolded for talking nonsense, we must report this to our nation. That night, the training ground near our lodgings was full of knights. Perosa. Ah, father. Perosa was among those knights. I was so pleased to think that Perosa felt competitive spirit rather than despair upon seeing that scar. As a father, I couldn't hide my pride in thinking she would become great in the future. But soon, news that would overshadow that pride arrived. The executive manager. Yes, the imperial family officially announced it. Though it wasn't the emperor himself, it was the crown prince's statement, so it's certain. It was the royal knight commander back home who delivered the news. I had sensed something was amiss from the dazed look on his face, but I hadn't expected the Empire to officially recognize the incident as the work of a human. Even more surprising was that it was attributed to the inspector who had been stationed at the academy for a year. Because of this, it seems Robin's academy will follow in Ernesto Academy's footsteps. I couldn't help but sigh at those words. It was unwelcome news for a knight of Armine. Robin's academy was Armane's pride, but now it was being forced to acknowledge the Empire's superiority. And the civil servants are in an uproar too since it's been confirmed that the records of the Great Northern War were true. I was puzzled at first, but I soon realized what he meant. Among the records Armine obtained by breaching the Empire's weakened counterintelligence network right after the war ended was the phrase, Kagan's strike tore the heavens and made the earth cry out. Still, most would dismiss such things as exaggerated accounts rather than taking them literally. For the civil servants, this must feel like a bolt from the blue. Moreover, the sudden display of force by the Empire has alarmed the military. My expression hardened at these words. It was true that showcasing military power at this time wasn't normal behavior. If it were a warning to the 3 countries' forces stationed at the academy, it should have been done last year. Provoking the 3 countries at this point, when smooth relations had been established, would be disadvantageous for the Empire too. Opinions are all over the place. Some say they're just using the prosecutor's office's executive manager from an imperial county family to raise imperial authority. Others think it's a move to completely suppress the kingdom of Zerano and dominate sea power. Still, others claim it's preparation for eastern expansion toward Leon, pressure on our country, or even the conquest of the north. The theories are endless. The commander let out a hollow laugh as if it were absurd, but his expression remained grim. Each possibility couldn't be ignored. A sudden display of force, happening in the sky above the academy when continental attention was already focused there due to the enrollment of figures from the 3 countries, including His Highness Rudis, and the mass enrollment of mages captivated by the Mage Duchess. Was it a mere coincidence, or was it a calculated statement? Robin's Academy's visit to the Imperial Academy isn't just for learning. Keep that in mind. I'll remember that. The meaning was clear. Armine would temporarily bow its head to avoid the Empire's blade, and as someone stationed at the Academy, I was to assess the Empire's true intentions. It was too heavy a duty for a mere knight, but at least it wasn't the worst-case scenario. At least it's not Armine. From what I had seen, the executive manager wasn't the type to remain calm in front of a representative from a country he was about to invade. He would either clearly draw a line or openly provoke them. At least, that was how the executive manager I'd seen had been. If that personality is thoroughly in act, it would mean they'd been preparing for an invasion even before His Highness Rudy's enrolled. What a terrifying possibility. Once I fully committed to the all-in-on Tanion strategy, I began my persuasion campaign in earnest. Tanion's recovery holy spells could quickly reattach severed limbs, but enhancement spells were his specialty, so wouldn't it be possible to cut the sky without getting hurt in the first place? Or, how could I refuse the Crown Prince's personal request to guide the future generations? I ran my mouth with all sorts of justifications. All right, then I'll let it slide just this once. Thank you for understanding, Mar. Thankfully, my impassioned arguments, or perhaps the promise of guaranteed safety, managed to convince everyone, including Margetta. Honestly, the latter probably played a much bigger role, but the outcome was what mattered. Anyway, thanks to the Tanion card, I avoided being a no-show in front of an audience that came all the way to watch. Robin's Academy says they're ready to come anytime. They've even said they'll teleport over immediately if granted permission. Such enthusiasm is admirable. Regardless of it being a foreign institution, their eagerness to learn is something worth following. Once the persuasion succeeded, everything else fell into place. For the principal, accepting Robin's Academy after Ernesto's earlier submission was a no-brainer. After all, it would cement his legacy as one of the Imperial Academy's greatest leaders. I'm overjoyed that there are frequent events injecting new life into this old man's dull twilight years. This must be thanks to you, Executive Manager. You're too kind. It's more due to the foundation you've built, Principal. Ho, that's quite embarrassing. As evidence, the principal maintained a smiling face throughout our conversation. You'd think he'd express some concern or confusion over the Academy's sky being split open, but no, he just nodded gently without any comments. Whether this generosity was due to Robin's Academy's surrender or because he'd reached enlightenment after enduring various trials for over a year, it was fortunate either way. As the principal said, wasn't that a good thing if his twilight years were filled with vitality instead of complications? It might be a twisted blessing, but I decided to think of it that way. Robin's Academy officially visited the Imperial Academy less than 3 days after the principal's approval. Robin's Academy's charge was spontaneous, unlike Ernesto Academy, which had rushed in while aiming for the club fair, so this was natural. I am Narsh Johaim, Vice Principal of Robin's Academy. Our principal also wished to come personally, but he couldn't greet you due to scheduling conflicts. Please understand, despite the impromptu nature of the visit, the visitors were anything but low profile. Although the principal didn't come personally, the vice principal, who was more renowned in the swordsmanship world than the principal, visited in person to ask for understanding about the principal's absence. This showed sufficient sincerity on Robin's Academy's part. We would be grateful if your principal had come personally, so how could we express disappointment at not meeting him? Please don't worry about it. Therefore, the Imperial Academy showed protocol befitting the principal's direct visit for the vice principal's visit, and the Robin's Academy side seemed reasonably satisfied with the reception by a higher-ranking person. Of course, they'd only be 100% satisfied after seeing Skycleaver with their own eyes. After all, what use was diplomatic protocol if they left without getting what they came for? Excuse me, is the gentleman next to you the prosecutor's office's executive manager? After exchanging greetings with the principal and vice principal, Narsh Johaim also greeted me, who was standing nearby. Yes, that's correct. It is an honor to receive such invaluable instruction from you, executive manager. I will treasure this day and never forget it. I felt slightly dizzy at the sight of Narsh Johaim bowing his head respectfully. They were suppressing their pride and humbling themselves right now, but the fallout would be unimaginable if we failed to deliver on the promise of the Skycleaver. Anyone would go crazy if the price of abandoning their pride was a no-show. Thank you, Tanion, you saved the relationship between the Empire and Armine. The executive manager immediately led the students directly to the training grounds for the demonstration. It's not a task that takes long. Delaying would be disrespectful to students who've come such a long way. Wouldn't it be better to see what they came for and then let them rest? This was welcome news for us. Having forcibly adjusted our academy's schedule to come to the Empire, it was bound to become harder to manage the repercussions the longer we stayed. As vice principal, I was already swamped with work. Prolonging this would only make things worse. So, we accepted the executive manager's offer. Achieving our goal on the first day meant we could return to our homeland as quickly as possible. There's quite a crowd. Meanwhile, it seemed the rumor had already spread. By the time we reached the training grounds, Imperial Academy students and staff had already gathered to watch. Understandably, they wouldn't want to miss such an experience. It was just odd that His Highness Rudes was among the Imperial Academy students. Your Highness. It was a strange situation where Armane's royalty was present at a place where Armane's pride was bowing to the Imperial Academy. As I smiled wryly at this oddity, a white-haired young man put his hand on the executive manager's shoulder and muttered something. Judging by the bright white light flickering around the young man and the executive manager, it must be a holy spell. This young man was probably Tanian NS, the future saint. After exchanging a few words with the future saint, the executive manager nodded and stood in the center of the training ground. I will begin. At those words, silence fell over the bustling training ground. The crowd stopped moving as if they didn't want to make even the sound of rustling clothes. The only one with the right to move in this situation was the executive manager. I was embarrassed to admit it, but I was in awe from the moment the executive manager drew his sword. For a warrior, the basics were more important than anything, and you could tell how thorough one's basics were just by looking at their stance. In that sense, the executive manager's stance was perfect. Even in simple preparatory movements, there were no flaws. The way he stepped forward, the way he extended his arm, it was impossible to look away. How much time and effort must he have devoted to reach such perfection? Yes, to achieve the feat of cutting the sky, one must have such solid basics. My admiration instantly turned to shock. As the executive manager slowly moved his sword, a violent mana circulation occurred in his heart. Then, that mana moved to the right side of his chest and exploded outward, flooding his right arm and sword as though consuming them entirely. It was an unnatural, reckless flow of mana, an operation so deranged that even attempting it without mastery would cause the heart to burst on the spot. Those who could sense this insane mana circulation all opened their mouths, watching the madman. The madman's feet unfolded in the sky. This time, my exclamation was for an entirely different reason. A black scar hideously marred the sky as if insulting it, spreading wider as if it would swallow the sky and become a new sky itself. Is it an evil god? The Dawn sect's scriptures say that evil gods who opposed Enon were sealed in the northern part of the continent. Though I had never seen those demon gods, I couldn't help but think that they'd manifest like this if they did, tearing and desecrating the sky, just as the executive manager had done. This is bad, very bad. I had been betrayed by the enhancement magic I put so much stock in. Well, at least my arm was still attached. It wasn't dangling by a thread, nor had it torn off and rolled across the ground like last time, so that must be a win, right? It burst from the inside. Unfortunately, only the outside was fine. Tanian must have properly enhanced the arm's appearance, but I could feel that the muscles, nerves, and bones under the skin were completely wrecked. Still, wasn't it better that it looked fine on the outside? This time, I could insist that I wasn't injured. After all, there was nothing visibly wrong. I could just say I couldn't lift my arm because it was aching from the sudden exertion. I should quietly ask Tanian for treatment after everyone else had left. Shit, if I'm caught, it's over. Chapter 317. You don't have this in your country 5. The version of Skycleaver I used was a downgraded imitation of Kagan's original. Even then, I hadn't dared to attempt it since getting stabbed by Kagan, but thanks to the Mage Duchess's potions, I had reached a level where I could recreate it. Somehow. However, while the recreation was perfect in terms of splitting the sky, it was still lacking in power. But what choice did I have? If I were to replicate the full power I used during the war, it wouldn't just be my arm, it might be my entire body that explodes. The technique begins by forcibly amplifying the mana within the body, but even the slightest manipulation would cause my old injuries to react violently. The potions I took might suppress the symptoms, but they wouldn't be able to erase the damage. So, I adjusted the power by moving my mana mainly through my arm, not my wounded torso. Still, it was unfortunate that my arm broke. This might actually be doable. At least it made sense. If my arm bore the brunt of the strain, then strengthening the arm might be the key to enduring the technique. Maybe I could use it repeatedly without issue with a reinforced arm. Bullshit. That simplistic line of thinking led to this. It didn't break off, but it burst from the inside. It might have been better if it had broken off. Tanian, who had approached quietly, sighed after examining my arm's condition. If the arm had burst outwards, the force would have dispersed. But since the explosion was contained inside the arm, its intensity was much more severe. His calm diagnosis made me a bit bitter. I didn't really want to know the process of how my arm was wrecked. Can you fix it? Yes. Fortunately, there's no problem with healing. True to his word, feeling returned to my right arm as soon as Tanian recited a prayer. The healing was flawless, but the enhancement clearly had its limits. Part of me wanted to accuse Tanian of deliberately holding back on the enhancement spell, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. Brother, it's embarrassing to say this, but since there's no precedent for cutting the sky, I can't be sure if my enhancement will be effective. It's beyond common sense, so I can't predict anything. In fact, Tanian had warned me beforehand. He said he'd apply the enhancement, but couldn't guarantee its effectiveness. It was a perfectly reasonable warning given the lack of precedent, but I pushed ahead anyway. It would be ugly to blame Tanian now. Moreover, the important thing was that I managed to pull off Sky Cleaver without a single visible injury. I was crazy. Tanian's enhancement holy spell was, in other words, the blessing of the future saint who received Enan's full favor. The moment it enveloped me, I could feel the lingering traces of Kagan's wound, specifically, the eternal energy of the blue sky that clung to the injury, being suppressed. Even as someone who wasn't a priest, I instinctively knew that it was being held back. The sheer contrast between the forces was unmistakable. And with that realization, a reckless ambition reared its head. Maybe I could push a little harder this time. So, I did it, and this was the result. My arm couldn't take it, not after channeling an even stronger force. It did get stronger, but still, it was definitely more powerful than the Sky Cleaver I used a few days ago. First, it was larger than before, and instead of shrinking over time, the scar slowly grew, as if devouring the nearby sky. Of course, it grew to a certain point and then shrank back, but the scar I made last time didn't grow at all. The difference was noticeable to anyone. Baby, it seems stronger than last time. I received an enhancement spell. I guess that's why it was more powerful. Because of this, I received suspicious looks from the Mage Duchess. If she had discovered then that my arm had burst internally, she would have probably collapsed in tears. After that, I might see her launching hellfire at the Armine students while saying it was all their fault. What a terrible scenario. If this is the result even with an enhancement spell, it would be better if you don't use it anymore. I couldn't readily answer Tanian's serious suggestion. Honestly, I couldn't promise not to use it again. With the technique publicly demonstrated under the imperial family's name, it was no longer just my personal burden, it was now tied to the empire's prestige and authority. Whether I liked it or not, I'd have to do it if the imperial family gave the order and incentivized me properly. It's fine, I think I've got a handle on it after using it a couple of times. As long as I adjust the power, it should end without any issues. That was the safest response I could manage. If I kept my greed in check and controlled the power, enhancement magic should suffice to keep everything intact. Damn it. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. If it weren't for my old injuries, I wouldn't need to worry about enhancement magic or my limbs exploding. I might even be able to match the original version of Sky Cleaver in power. At the very least, I'd be able to wield something even stronger than the version I just used. This won't do. I need to increase my prayers to the eternal blue sky to 5 times a day. Apparently, my feat of tearing the sky apart, even at the cost of my arm, had impressed the higher-ups. Good work, Executive Manager. You're too kind. How could we neglect guests who've submitted to the Empire's might? I got a call from the Crown Prince not long after receiving treatment from Tanian. Judging by the speed of his response, the report must have been sent up almost immediately. Haha, that's right. The Empire would never mistreat those who acknowledge its superiority. You're absolutely right. Seeing him burst into laughter at my polite response, he must be in quite a good mood. He has reason to be. I could understand his joy. While Ernesto Academy's visit and surrender to the Empire was something to be happy about, it was an inevitable outcome from the moment the Mage Duchess came to the Academy. Moreover, the United Kingdom of Yuban was far from the Empire and not a very threatening country due to its unique United Kingdom system. However, the kingdom of Armine was different. Just as the Empire looked for opportunities to bring Armine to its knees, Armine was also always looking for chances to undermine the Empire. Unlike the magic world where the Mage Duchess provided an overwhelming advantage, there was no reason for Armine to surrender to the Empire in the swordsmanship world. Additionally, Armine was a neighboring country. Before Kagan's appearance, any disturbance in the north often meant tension with Armine. But now, Armine had formally acknowledged the Empire's superiority. For a crown prince on the verge of ascending the throne, having a rival nation bow before him must feel like an early coronation gift. However, it's the executive manager's ability that satisfied our guests. The imperial family will not forget your steadfast loyalty and dedication. I'm deeply honored. It was just a typical compliment, but I couldn't help feeling uneasy. Somehow, it sounded like a promise to work me into the ground for eternity under the guise of honoring my service. If that was the case, then I'd rather be forgotten. Being visible to the imperial family would only invite more responsibility. The executive manager position really wasn't meant for me. From now on, entertaining our guests will be the principal's job. You may rest, executive manager. Yes, Your Highness. Thank you for your consideration. With those words, the call ended. How strange. It was clearly a call meant to offer praise, yet all I was left with was the dread of being locked into lifelong service. What a brilliant bastard. After arriving at the lodgings prepared by the Imperial Academy, the students either went to their rooms or headed to the training ground. As I walked to my assigned room, I observed the students' faces, which fell into two distinct categories. Those lost in thought and feeling doubtful after seeing the sky torn apart, and those burning with competitive spirit after witnessing a human achievement. I hope the former group will also gather their resolve and turn their doubts into passion. As much as I wanted to help guide them through this process as their vice principal, I didn't have the luxury of time right now. So it was true. Yes, we can no longer deny it. I contacted the principal who remained at the academy and gave a bitter report as soon as I reached my room. It was true that a swordsman from the Empire had cut the sky. I heard the executive manager received a holy spell before cutting the sky. Was it an enhancement spell? After a moment of silence, the principal raised a very reasonable question. I also thought that what the executive manager received from the future saint was an enhancement spell. Principal, could you cut the sky if you received an enhancement spell? But what difference did an enhancement spell make? It wasn't like others could cut the sky if they received an enhancement spell, and warriors going to war naturally received enhancement spells anyway. I just asked to confirm. Civil servants need to know every detail to be satisfied. The principal seemed to share my thoughts while smiling bitterly at my response. Those civil servants were always nitpicking about things they didn't understand about the field. How are the students? Some are sitting dejectedly in front of the wall, but more are determined to overcome it. That's a relief. The principal, who had been writing a report for the administration, smiled slightly at those words. Although the position of Robin's Academy principal was appointed according to political custom, he was an educator at his core. He was bound to be happy that the students who will lead the future have chosen to persevere rather than despair. The principal sighed after asking questions for a while, presumably having finished writing the report. You've worked hard traveling so far. The administration should be satisfied with this, so rest adequately before returning. Yes, I'll do that. I leaned back in my chair as the call ended and the crystal lost its light. I felt conflicted. As a swordsman, I was thrilled to witness the pinnacle of swordsmanship, an achievement that transcended mortal limits. But as someone from Armine, the emergence of a swordsman in the Empire capable of cleaving the sky filled me with dread. The Empire was already recovering from wounds inflicted in the war with the nomads. For a neighboring nation like Armine, the appearance of such a symbol was deeply concerning. It was somewhat fortunate that the executive manager belonged to the administration rather than the military, but such affiliations could easily be changed. Dogs that bite don't bark. Still, there was hope. If the Empire truly aimed for war with Armine, they would have attacked suddenly without such a display. That would have been more effective. The public display and the permission for Robin's Academy to visit all suggested that the Empire might be content with diplomatic concessions rather than seeking to establish a hierarchy through war. It had to be that. If the Empire were to choose war with the executive manager on the front lines, it would be a replay of the nightmare from the time of the Iron-Blooded Duke. Indeed, it wasn't just mages who were crazy, swordsmen were definitely crazy, too. You really didn't get hurt this time, right? That's right. Then, advisor, does that mean you can use it occasionally in the future? I don't know. Eric and Rudy's looked visibly disappointed at the vague answer, but this was for their own good. There were no eternal lies in this world. With the kind of cursed luck I've had, I couldn't afford to make promises I can't keep. If we're caught, we all go down together. If anyone realized my arm had exploded internally, or if I used the technique again at someone's request and got injured, there were 4 people who would flip out. Where would their anger be directed then? There were already a few people giving sharp looks to these 2 men clinging to me and calling for an encore. Even now, they were in a full state of alert even when they believed my body was safe. What would happen if even that safety guarantee crumbled? We'd all die immediately. Maybe even the Crown Prince would die with us. If you do it too often, people stop finding it amazing. What's that supposed to mean? Don't try to understand it. Just accept it in your heart. Honestly, showing it off twice is already more than enough. Chapter 318. Let's get some fresh air. 1. The Imperial Academy underwent significant changes after Robin's Academy's visit. First, the proportion of the student body occupying the training grounds shifted heavily in favor of the swordsmanship department. Of course, I had cut the sky before Robin's Academy's visit, but the students only saw the result of the sky being split back then, not the process of me swinging the sword. This time, however, the students who flocked after hearing rumors witnessed the entire process, making them believe that a human had indeed cut the sky. As a result, students filled with competitive spirit practically lived in the training grounds, while the magic department students, pushed out by the frenzied swordsmanship students, had no choice but to retreat to the library while cursing all the way. Good day, Executive Manager. Oh, yes, Executive Manager. Good morning. Ah, yes, good morning. Respect and admiration seemed to spread alongside ambition, as the number of students greeting me skyrocketed. Needless to say, over 90% of these students were from the swordsmanship department. It was an utterly unfamiliar situation. In the past, the students usually observed me from a distance or approached me indirectly through Eric even when I occasionally attracted their attention. Now, students popped up like random encounters to talk to me. Thankfully, eye contact didn't immediately trigger duels, but as someone who had always avoided unnecessary interaction with students, this new attention was overwhelming. When civilians approached excessively, it was civil servants who ended up suffering from nervous exhaustion. I can't push them away, either. I could at least avoid them if they were malicious civilians, but these were innocent students, full of pure admiration, and were approaching with nothing but respect in their eyes. Even aside from managing my reputation, my conscience wouldn't allow it. Isn't it good to be popular? I think you'll inspire more students to want to join the prosecutor's office, Executive Manager. Are you a genius? I received an unexpected response when I contacted the first manager with such complaints. Come to think of it, she was right. If I became an object of admiration, new civil servants would flock in without any effort on my part. Just look at the Magic Tower, it was overflowing with mages enchanted by the Mage Duchess. The prosecutor's office could easily follow the same path. Auto recruitment. I felt like shedding tears of joy. Manpower that gathered on its own without me having to go around handing out recommendation letters was a miracle I didn't dare dream of. It'll be easier from now on. Usually, only those with considerable ambition or the crazy ones joined the prosecutor's office. Did you really have to say that to my face? But it's true, so what can I do? The first manager pouted as if asking why I was scolding her. I felt like pinching her cheek right away, but sadly, she had a point. While the prosecutor's office's role and authority were considerable, the corresponding workload and responsibility made it a place difficult to enter unless they were consumed by the desire for promotions or just plain crazy. This was especially true after I became the executive manager and caused quite a stir. Some people tested the waters by briefly joining to pad their resumes, but very few stayed long enough to leave their mark. The moment someone showed promise, they were off to greener pastures in another department. Those bastards. Like Leaf Village ninjas, they ghosted as soon as we had invested in training them. One of the measures we took to prevent this exodus was the recommendation letter system. Of course, the primary role of recommendation letters was to discover talent others might have missed, but frankly, it was also a kind of branding. If someone joined the prosecutor's office with my recommendation and later tried to defect to another department, they'd need a pretty thick skin to live with the shame. By the way, Executive Manager. Yes. As I was imagining a happy future where people would commit to the department without recommendation letters, the first manager cautiously spoke up. You're really okay, right? I couldn't help but smile at her rare, careful question. She knew the situation to some extent, so I guess she was worried too. I'm fine. Do you think Beatrix would have stayed quiet if something had gone wrong? Well, that's true. Genuinely convinced, the anxiety and worry that had lingered on the first manager's face instantly disappeared. The senior staff, including the first manager, knew about Kagan's stab wound on my body. It wasn't exactly something to boast about, so I didn't show it to them directly, but I did go for treatment several times right after becoming the prosecutor's office's executive manager. An executive manager who consistently went for treatment even while busy dealing with internal opposition and the Second Prince's faction. Even the most oblivious person would think, this guy's injury is no ordinary wound. So when such a person suddenly started tearing the sky apart, concerns were bound to rise. Well, what is there to worry about with the future saint and the continent's best mage around? Honestly, it does seem safer than the capital. Exactly. In a place defended by the ultimate holy spell user and the pinnacle of magic, the only way to receive an unrecoverable diagnosis was to die instantly. And with Kagan in the afterlife, who could send me there in one blow? Even Dorgan couldn't do that. Still, please tell us in advance next time. We were really surprised when we suddenly heard you had cut the sky. At those words, I silently looked at the first manager. Despite her attempt to appear cheerful, I could sense the bitterness and hurt hidden beneath. It was understandable. From the first manager's perspective, of course she'd feel hurt. Hearing about your lover's potential injury through rumors rather than from the person themselves would make anyone feel slighted. That was my mistake. With the final boss beside me who could overturn everything with magic if I made a wrong move, I didn't even think about the first manager, who was in the capital. I'm sorry. I'll tell you right away from now on. As long as you understand. I smiled gently at the first manager's exaggerated snort. There won't be any, so there was someone like that, situations. No, why do you remember things like that so well? Who could forget something like that? If someone did, they'd be the strange one. Anyway, I ended the call by asking her to pass on my regards to the fourth manager if they came in touch. The fourth manager seemed to have gone north already as I couldn't reach her. If only Dorgan would die quickly so that the fourth manager could get some rest. As the Crown Prince said, the principal took charge of managing the guests who came to the academy. My role ended with cutting the sky, and besides, it wouldn't be appropriate for an inspector to entertain guests. Meanwhile, Robin's Academy seemed to be engaging in various activities for their study visit, but in such cases, the head instructor of the swordsmanship department handled it smoothly. Since the vice principal of Robin's Academy was from a rival faction, he dealt with it enthusiastically. He seemed to have the highest job satisfaction, so I let it be. Mar, I'm here. And while the principal and head instructor were fulfilling their roles, I was practically rooted in the student council room. Word had apparently spread among the Robin's Academy students that I was often found in the clubroom, as some brave souls even came there. To protect my precious little free time, I needed to find a suitable place to hide. Disturbing an off-duty civil servant was a crime. Welcome. Are you running away again today? Running away? I came because I wanted to see you, Mar. I appreciate the sentiment, at least. I felt embarrassed after seeing Margetta's smile. Of course, I visited her every day even before being hounded by students, but now I was staying longer than before. She must have known from the start that I came to hide. I heard the Robin's Academy students will be returning to their homeland soon. The academy is going to feel empty again. The subtle glint in her eyes as she spoke made it clear. She was implying how much she'd miss me staying here as often once the Robin's students were gone. It was an unmistakable, gentle pressure. How can it be empty when the people who weren't here originally are just going back? The people who are here will be enough. Foo-foo, I suppose so. With such obvious hints, I had no choice but to promise to keep showing up. Looks like the student council president's office is going to become my second clubroom now. Besides, while this was Margetta's last year, I still had to be at the academy for another year. We would have to spend a year apart, so we should stick together as much as possible this year. Do we have to live separately even after getting married? Now that I thought about it, something felt off. We were planning to get married when Margetta graduated, but I, the groom, still had to stay at the academy. That didn't seem right. Next year, I'd either have to hire a teleportation mage to commute daily or find a way for Margetta to stay at the academy. Becoming a goose dad right after marriage didn't sit well with me. If worst comes to worst, I'll have to sign a one-year contract. If I couldn't find a good solution no matter how hard I looked, then I'd just hire a mage. It wasn't like I'd had much time to spend the gold piling up in my vault. I might as well put it to good use, make the money circulate and all that. Betrayals come without warning, that was why they were called betrayals. Oh, Carl, can you take a look at this for a moment? The vice president quietly entered the student council room, handed a stack of documents to Margetta, and disappeared. Margetta stared at the sudden pile of paperwork with a resigned look before she began flipping through it. Shortly after, she called out to me with an awkward tone. It was strange. Last year, she often asked me to help with student council work, but honestly, that was just an excuse to spend time with me. Now that we were officially a couple, there was no need for such pretenses. Yet she called me. It must mean that something bizarre and troublesome had happened. What's the matter? So, pushing back my unease, I approached Margetta, and she showed me the documents she was holding. Carl, you can't see it if you close your eyes. Just let me stay like this for a moment. The moment my eyes caught the familiar words on the document, I instinctively shut them tight. Damn it, I saw it. I saw it all. A familiar sentence was engraved in the document, words so unfathomable that it made me wonder why they were appearing at the academy now of all times. It's a document about this year's school trip. When I closed my eyes, Margetta kindly started explaining the contents. No, you don't have to. I'm not ready to hear this yet. We were planning to go to the Boyar Duchy again like last year, but it looks like we'll have to revise the plan. Yes, I see, but closing my eyes and covering my ears wouldn't undo what had already happened. From the Boyar Duchy to the Chenis Duchy. I wonder if it'll be Vulcan next year. I couldn't bring myself to speak even though Margetta was even making jokes. The Chenis Duchy, a region in the Western Empire ruled by the Salon ducal family. And the current head of the Salon ducal family and Duchess of Chenis was Caarrrll. Long time no see. The drunkard Duchess, I mean, the wise Duchess. This was driving me crazy. I hadn't even seen her yet, but I could already picture her enthusiastically waving a wine bottle while shouting my name. Get out of my head right now, drunkard Duchess. Chapter 319, Let's get some fresh air too. I was able to think rationally after chasing the embarrassing ant out of my nephew's head. Why Chenis? To be more accurate, I was able to deny reality rationally, but that was beside the point. Anyway, it was confusing. Putting aside how embarrassing the wise Duchess was, the fact that Chenis Duchy, not Boyar Duchy, was the school trip destination wasn't normal. One might think it would be strange to go to the same place for 2 years in a row, but wasn't the Gold Duke the reason school trips were added to the Academy's schedule in the first place? The school trip originated from inviting Academy students to a resort built in his territory for promotion. Would that money-crazed man use such a massive promotional tool only once and then give it up to someone else? Absolutely not. Giving it up because the other party was a duke. The Gold Duke would charge even the imperial family when money was involved, so that couldn't be it. It would make sense if it were some other duchy. Moreover, Chenis Duchy was renowned as a tourist destination. From the Gold Duke's perspective, giving up the school trip location to Chenis Duchy would be like boosting a competitor's position. No landowner would willingly do that, let alone the Gold Duke. This is unexpected. The resort must be fully booked this year. So when I muttered with puzzlement, Margetta, who was still reading the documents, let out a short exclamation. Your guess is right, Carl. Pardon, the resort we stayed at last year has been designated as an Imperial Certified Tourist Site. With those words, all my doubts instantly vanished. An Imperial Certified Tourist Site, the first new one in nearly a decade. Then, not only the resort but nearby accommodations must be bursting at the seams. In such a saturated state, there was no need to invite Academy students on top of that. Certified Tourist Site. It was strange that such a system existed in this era, but this world's setting had come too far to nitpick about such things. And if the Gold Duke gave up hosting the school trip in exchange for receiving the gift of a certified tourist site from the imperial family, then the decision to send the Academy to the Chenis Duchy came directly from the imperial family. Now, we needed to figure out the imperial family's intentions, not the Gold Duke's. We were lucky. Not only is Boyar already famous as a tourist spot, but now it's also an imperial certified site. It'll be packed with people for years to come. Yes, I suppose it will. It's a relief we got to see it early. But I smiled back at Margetta, who was grinning slightly, and put aside my thoughts. I returned her smile and shelved my concerns for now. Questioning imperial intentions was an excellent way to ruin your life. And mine was tangled enough as it was. Further complications might make biting my tongue and ending it all seem like the better option. Let's not worry about it. Besides, it wasn't like I had no idea at all. I'm especially worried about the distinguished guests. They're not used to life in the Empire, so I'm concerned they might wander off alone. That was what the Emperor had said during a luncheon he invited me to while hosting the New Year's ball. The Emperor suspected that the trio of foreign royalty studying at the Academy might be acting as spies. In such a situation, sending students twice to Boyar, one of the Empire's duchies and a center of commerce, shipping, and naval power, would be irritating. From his perspective, sending them somewhere completely different would make much more sense. It was sad to see an old man in poor health worrying needlessly, but I didn't have the courage to defend the suspects in front of an emperor who had reasonable suspicion. Honestly, it was their fault for enrolling in another country's academy when they were royalty. If you ask me, the emperor's concerns were perfectly valid. It didn't take long before the news spread that this year's school trip destination was Chenis. It was only natural, as there was no reason to keep it secret. Chenis is in the west, right? It'll be my first time there. Louise seemed delighted by the prospect of visiting a new location. Ah, Chenis. Meanwhile, Eric looked like he might faint at the thought of having to go to Chenis, where the wise Duchess was holding out. Unfortunately, Eric was also one of those who have been tormented by the wise Duchess. In fact, he was probably more of a victim than I was. Unlike me, who could minimize contact with the wise Duchess thanks to the shield of being the prosecutor's office's executive manager, Eric had no such buffer and had to deal with her antics directly. I can't skip it, can I? If you want to see your communication crystal lit up 24/7 during the school trip, go ahead. What I really meant was, if you don't show up, she'll likely demand a live, 24-hour video feed of your face. Eric grimaced and squeezed his eyes shut, as if to shut out the horrifying image. He knew I wasn't exaggerating. If the wise Duchess heard that one of her nephews didn't come, she'd probably wail and immediately pull out her communication crystal. It might sound crazy, but the wise Duchess was more than capable of doing that. He shouldn't underestimate a drunkard even the Emperor had given up on. What's wrong? I thought Chenis was known for its many tourist attractions. Do you have some bad memories there? I do have some unpleasant memories with the current matriarch there. Lather asked, seemingly puzzled after seeing Eric's reaction, but Eric's answer only confused him more. Her Grace the wise Duchess is our aunt. Eric takes after our uncle a bit, so he receives her Grace's affection a bit excessively. Ah, instead of elaborating, I saw Lather nod as if he understood. Judging by his reaction, he seemed to have realized that the word, affection, held many memories, but he didn't say anything out of consideration for Eric's dignity. Right, I wouldn't tell anyone about how little Eric received a barrage of kisses from the wise Duchess, almost having his cheeks sucked off. I heard Eric was crying and making a fuss back then. Oh, I didn't know you were related to a ducal family. That's impressive. Meanwhile, Rudy spoke as if surprised. Considering his background as a prince, it felt less like a compliment and more like teasing, but it must be sincere based on his personality. Besides, even among the Empire's nobility, it wasn't widely known that Eric and I were related to the wise Duchess. How much more would that be for foreigners? We're related through a bridge, though. The bridge linking the wise Duchess to House Crossius was the Aras family. While my uncle had taken the wise Duchess's last name as part of their marriage agreement, Mother's surname also changed to Crossius after she and the patriarch married. It was enough to confuse anyone who wasn't paying close attention. Of course, high-ranking nobles and officials who dealt with me often wouldn't fail to notice. I've never gone around calling myself her nephew, though. Haha, not relying on your family's influence is admirable. Right, thanks. Unlike Rudy's, who laughed heartily, Eric mumbled with a somewhat bitter expression. I understood why. I knew exactly why Eric chose to keep his connection to the wise Duchess under wraps. Because having her as an aunt is embarrassing no matter where you go. If even I, a possessor, felt this way, then how much worse must it be for Eric, who was her actual blood relative? Being related to the wise Duchess was a heavy burden, even at a casual gathering. It was enough to make anyone think twice before ordering a drink. Fortunately, Sarah seemed to notice Eric's feelings and carefully approached to pat him. Seeing this, Rudy stepped aside with a satisfied expression. That bastard. I couldn't help but feel both frustrated and pitiful every time I saw Rudis's uncanny ability to notice others' romantic affairs. If fate ever found him another relationship, I hope he'd act just like how he did now. Oppa, yes. Louise quietly spoke up while I was wishing blessings on Rudis's love life. Do you know what's famous in Chenis? We didn't get a pamphlet this year. Ah, the pamphlet. I nodded unconsciously at her obvious statement. Last year, there was a pamphlet because a certain money-obsessed duke was desperate to earn every penny, but normally there wouldn't be one. Who would go around distributing pamphlets just because the academy was coming for a school trip? Only someone like the Gold Duke would pull something so absurd. I do know a bit. Chenis is a well-known tourist spot, after all. Besides, whether it was Boyar or Chenis, there were many famous spots you could find without a pamphlet. First of all, the region is famous for its grain fields. The Chenis Duchy owned the continent's, not just the empire's, largest granary region, with fields and farmlands stretching to the horizon. It was even said that famine would spread across the entire continent if there was a poor harvest in Chenis Duchy, so that was how grand it was. While the truth of that claim was debatable, it was undeniable that the empire heavily relied on Chenis for its food supply. There's also an old airship grounded near the coastline. And there was the airship, or what used to be one, hovering the line between being an eyesore and a landmark. There must have been an Apelles emperor obsessed with fantasy, because Apelles had a fleet of airships. Of course, fantasy was just another word for inefficiency, so they disappeared one by one due to maintenance costs, and the last remaining ship was operated during the war with Kefalofen but crashed due to fuel shortage. What an idiot. The reason they were still preserving such a thing was simple. It was just kept as a negative example, symbolizing the height of inefficiency and the ugliness of Apelles. There's also a sanctuary for non-human races. Lastly, there was an area protecting races that were hard to find in other countries. It was the only place where races that nearly went extinct during Apple's reign barely maintained their lineage, and a symbolic place allowing the Kefalofen emperor to call himself an ally of other races. Come to think of it, this sounded more like an administrative zone than a tourist destination. Was this unavoidable when seen through a civil servant's eyes? Still, among this administrative district-like lineup, something seemed to catch Louise's interest as her eyes sparkled. A sanctuary for non-human races. Yeah, elves, dwarves, mermaids, beastkin, all sorts of races are there. Thanks to this, you could see mermaids in the sea, elves in the neighboring forest, and dwarves in the mountains behind. If you looked hard enough, you might even find a dragon lurking somewhere. It was the ultimate setting for anyone who dreamt of a fantasy fiefdom. If the wise Duchess raised 100,000 knights or 1,000,000 private soldiers, the fantasy would be complete. Anyway, Louise listened to my explanation with a bright expression, seemingly intrigued by the idea of different races living together with humans. Then, as if something occurred to her, she glanced to the side. Ah, following her gaze, I could see the Mage Duchess quietly twitching her ears. It seems the curiosity wasn't limited to the disciple but extended to the master as well. Indeed, from the Mage Duchess's perspective, the sanctuary for other races must be interesting. It was the first opportunity to meet her own kind, something she hadn't experienced since her mother's time. She probably never had a reason to go. Before becoming a duchess, her mother was still alive, so there was no need to seek out her own kind. And after becoming a duchess, she was too busy with work to have time. I'll make sure to take her there. The thought made my chest tighten. An elf who grew up never knowing her kin, how tragic was that? Chapter 320, Let's Get Some Fresh Air 3. Anyone who knew even a little about the Gold Duke's nature would have assumed this year's school trip would be to Boyar again. I thought so, Margetta thought so, and so did the principal. Honestly, probably all the academy students thought so. After all, the Golden Duke's obsession with money wasn't just well known in the Empire, it was practically a universal fact across the continent. With a title with the word, gold, how could anyone not know? That was why VR, like everyone else, assumed Boyar was the inevitable destination this year. When the sudden change to Chenis was announced, he was caught in the drift along with everyone else. I may not know much about the Empire, but I've heard Chenis is quite an attractive place too. I think it would be good for the students to visit various places to broaden their horizons. You're right, but VR's expression was too calm, hardly what you'd expect from someone blindsided by a sudden decision. I wasn't sure whether this was due to his seasoned composure, or if he just thought that Boyar and Chenis were pretty much the same. Actually, it didn't matter either way. It made my life easier if VR and the other foreign representatives accepted the change without a fuss. How annoying would it be if the poor dispatched civil servants, trembling at the thought of their charges being in danger, had a fit asking, why Chenis? Is there some conspiracy? Besides, I heard the wise Duchess is your aunt, executive manager. That must mean you're familiar with scenes, right? I'm sure it will make for an enjoyable trip. Still, being calm and fulfilling one's duty were separate issues. As the person in charge of security, VR needed to check all possibilities, so he casually mentioned my relationship with the wise Duchess. Haha, not particularly. I stayed in our territory when I was young, and now I spend most of my time in the capital, so I rarely had to visit Chenis. Of course, I quickly denied such an absurd suspicion. While it was true that I had a connection with the wise Duchess, I certainly didn't intervene in selecting the school trip destination. Why would I willingly go to Chenis? I was already reluctant to go to any duchy, especially Chenis. If something happened in Boyar, I could at least ask the Gold Duke for help. But if something happened in Chenis, the one I'd have to ask for help was the wise Duchess. Absolutely not. Regardless of the wise Duchess's abilities, I should avoid borrowing her hand as much as possible. With any other duke, it was a simple exchange, returning a favor later would be enough. But with the wise Duchess, the repayment was guaranteed to be something utterly ridiculous. Carl, Caarrrll. Then, can you give me a piggyback ride? Sorry. Surprisingly, this was a true story. Once, I owed the wise Duchess a favor for a work-related matter, and her request was so straightforward yet so outrageous that I nearly lost my mind. And yes, I actually had to give her that piggyback ride. Damn it, the embarrassment of that day was something I'd never forget. Sure, you could frame it as showing off my close relationship with a duke, but if I needed to give someone a piggyback ride to demonstrate that bond, maybe it'd be better to keep quiet. Besides, what was the point of flaunting a connection I'd rather keep silent about? Is that so? This school trip will be special for you too, then, executive manager. Yes, I'm looking forward to it as well. Anyway, VR seemed to believe me and nodded nonchalantly. Still, there was something about the way he called it a special trip that felt uncomfortably fitting. It was going to be special, all right. Now that I had confirmed that the three countries' forces had no complaints about going to Chenis, it was time to inform the host about how many guests would be coming. It might not be necessary to inform them since the selection of Chenis as the school trip destination was the imperial family's will, but failing to observe such small courtesies when visiting someone else's territory was a sure way to get on their bad side. That's all. I'll send a detailed list separately. Got it. Thanks for taking the time despite your busy schedule. Especially when the host was a relative who also happened to be the only person capable of curbing the wise Duchess's infamous drinking habits. How valuable was an existence that could somewhat restrain a drunkard even the emperor had given up on? I'll let her know right away. She'll be thrilled to hear you reached out. She'll probably just get mad that I didn't contact her directly. Haha, you're probably right. My uncle burst into laughter at my sincere words. I wished he had denied it at this point. Still, it's better to deal with the complaints later. Hearing my uncle's laughter made me feel conflicted, but this was the right choice. Technically, informing the territory's lord directly would be the proper protocol, but trying to discuss business with the wise Duchess would inevitably steer off into unpredictable territory. I'd much rather deal with her late-stage grumbling than the chaos of a derailed conversation. Besides, wasn't my uncle acting as a liaison with the outside world to assist the wise Duchess, who was all in on SimCity? If I stretched it out a bit, reaching out to him instead was completely reasonable. Speaking of which, it'll be nice to see Eric again. I hardly get to see the boy these days. The shift to a more personal topic made me nod slightly. Unlike the patriarch, mother, or me, who all participated in the New Year's ball annually, Eric didn't have the same opportunities to cross paths with my uncle. He was a regular noble heir, after all. Even as the wise Duchess's husband, my uncle couldn't go out of his way to visit a minor noble unless absolutely necessary. Of course, uncle and aunt would welcome Eric warmly if he were to visit the Chenis Duchy, but sadly, Eric was desperately avoiding our aunt. That was the weight of the trauma the wise Duchess inflicted on him as a child. We'll come to greet you together. If you could tell us a good time. No need, I'll come to see him myself. Let him rest. I can't have a grown nephew dealing with his aunt's antics. I quietly lowered my gaze at those words. My uncle was basically saying that he'd rather visit himself than risk exposing Eric to the wise Duchess, who might trigger a full-blown meltdown. Just what kind of torment did Eric endure for my uncle to go to these lengths? It couldn't have been an ordinary incident. Was there something I didn't know about? I felt curious, but I didn't particularly want to find out. After all, there were some secrets in this world that should remain buried forever. Anyway, I'll make it look like we met by chance, so when you arrive at the lodgings, can't. Babe, what are you up to? A new voice with a familiar, drunken slur suddenly barged into the room where only Uncle should have been. Great, we're doomed. Would a broken arm get me out of the school trip? No, Tannian would heal it right away. Then, how about a high fever? No, that would be worse. If I wasn't unconscious, then I'd have to suffer through both the sickness and Aunt's constant check-ins. There was no escaping her once she became involved. This is driving me crazy. I sighed, lying on the bed. Why did it have to be Chenis, of all places? We could just go to Boyar like last year, or there was also Vulcan or Servet if it had to be a different duchy. But no, it just had to be the far western Chenis. I knew that Chenis was famous as a tourist destination. Aunt wasn't a cruel person, either. In fact, she always smiled when we met and gave me plenty of pocket money. But it was just a bit much. My little nephew, give Auntie a kiss. Ah, so cute, I wish you could stay little forever. Nom 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 nom. No, it was way too much. Even at a young age, I seriously wondered if Aunt thought of me as a doll. Your aunt just adores you, so don't be too scared. Desperate, I'd brought up the topic of the trip with Mother during one of our calls. Her response, though phrased kindly, was ultimately soul-crushing. It was just a nice way of saying, you're on your own, I can't do anything about her. Why were none of the adults I knew normal? The patriarch was extremely blunt, and Aunt was the polar opposite. I wish there was a middle ground, but there wasn't. Life. If there was one tiny glimmer of hope, it was that I was legally an adult in the Empire now. Surely even Aunt wouldn't bite and suck on her adult nephew's cheeks, right? If Aunt had any dignity as a duchess. No, if she had any dignity, she probably wouldn't be drunk in the first place. I pressed my fingers against my temples, trying to soothe my pounding head while brainstorming ways to avoid her. Just then, the communication crystal on my bedside table began to glow. What is it now? I frowned at the unexpected call. Who would be calling at this hour? Still, a call this late must be important. And even if it wasn't, outright ignoring them wouldn't do. This is Eric, little Nepheew. I instinctively closed my eyes at the voice that seemed to pierce my eardrums. Of course it just had to be Aunt. Right as I was thinking about her, she called. Did I have some kind of cursed power that allowed me to manifest my own nightmares? Your auntie is so touched. My little nephew, I heard you were going to call me. What on earth was she talking about now? I almost had to endure the wise duchess's whining, but people often displayed unknown strengths in times of crisis. With miraculous quick thinking, I was able to dodge the bomb that was the wise duchess. I'm sorry. The problem was, it wasn't a complete dodge, but one that required a sacrificial lamb. I offered my sincere apologies to Eric, who now suddenly had to deal with the wise duchess's drunken rambling. Nephew, how could you do this to me? Don't you know how much I love you? Well, you see, Eric mentioned that he hadn't talked to Auntie in a while and really wanted to catch up. I just graciously stepped aside for him. It was a flimsy excuse, even by my own standards. Lise, my little nephew never even tried to contact me. He was probably nervous about calling after so long. Why don't you try calling him first? Oh, is that so? But what could I do? I had to save myself first. I'm sorry, Eric. Still, enduring the wise duchess's drunken affection was practically a rite of passage for the Crossius family. Besides, if he ever entered politics or the social circles, he would carry the prestigious title of the beloved by the wise duchess. Wasn't that a win? At least, that was what I told myself. The next day, during club time. Are you okay? No. Eric slumped in his seat, emitting fatigue and betrayal from every pore.